Somewhere in a driveway in 1978, a father crouches beside his brand new Honda Civic, showing his son the rear wheel. He pulls back a dusty metal shoe and says something the boy will remember for the rest of his life. He says, "This is why we don't need anything fancier back here." That simple sentence explains one of the most quietly debated engineering decisions in Japanese automotive history. For nearly 50 years, two of the most advanced car manufacturers on the planet, companies capable of building precision engines that revolutionized the world, kept something as old-fashioned as drum brakes bolted onto the rear wheels of even their newest cars. It wasn't ignorance. It wasn't laziness. It was a decision rooted in a philosophy that goes back to the earliest days of Japanese manufacturing itself, and today this story goes back to that root to understand exactly why two of the smartest engineering cultures on Earth held on to something so many people assumed was obsolete. To understand the stubbornness of the drum brake, one has to travel back to Japan in the years following the Second World War, to a landscape of bombed factories, rationed steel, and an economy rebuilding itself almost from nothing. Toyota, founded originally as a loom manufacturer before Kiichiro Toyota pivoted the company toward automobiles, and later Honda, born out of Soichiro Honda's small piston ring workshop in Hamamatsu, grew up in this exact environment of scarcity. Every gram of metal, every liter of brake fluid, every yen spent on a single component had to be justified to a population that could barely afford transportation at all, let alone a private automobile. Engineers of this generation weren't chasing performance or prestige. They were chasing survival first, then reliability, then affordability in that exact order, because a car that broke down on a rutted, unpaved road with no nearby garage was worse than useless in post-war Japan. Drum brakes, a technology already decades old by that point, having first appeared on French Renault vehicles as early as 1902, fit this philosophy with almost poetic precision. They were cheap to cast from simple iron, straightforward to assemble on primitive tooling that Japanese factories were still rebuilding piece by piece, and forgiving of the loose manufacturing tolerances that plagued the industry in those early years. This root, planted in the literal rubble of 1945, grew so deep into the culture of these companies that it outlived the very scarcity that had created it in the first place, echoing forward through generations of engineers who had never personally known that original hardship, yet inherited its lessons as unquestioned company doctrine. The mechanical case for the drum brake went beyond simple economics, and this is where the nostalgia of old workshops meets real physics. A drum brake works by pressing curved shoes outward against the inside of a spinning metal drum, and because of something engineers call the self-energizing effect, the rotation of the drum itself helps pull the leading shoe tighter against its surface, essentially using the car's own forward motion to amplify the driver's braking force. In plain terms, a small amount of pedal effort could be multiplied into a surprisingly strong stopping force, using components that were cheap, compact, and nearly indestructible under normal use. On the rear axle specifically, where a car carries far less weight during braking than the front axle, since weight transfers forward under deceleration, this self-energizing effect was more than sufficient stopping power for decades of ordinary driving, from a Toyota Corona navigating Tokyo traffic to a Honda N360 puttering through a rice farming village. There was also the matter of the parking brake, something almost nobody thinks about but that shaped countless assembly line decisions across both companies. A drum brake naturally incorporates a simple, reliable mechanical parking brake using little more than a lever, a return spring, and a length of steel cable, something a farmer in rural Japan or a rice deliverman in Osaka could repair himself with tools already sitting in his shed. Disc brakes, by contrast, required an entirely separate mechanism, either a small secondary drum built inside the disc hat or a more complicated caliper-actuated parking system, just to achieve the same basic function. For engineers trained to distrust unnecessary complexity, this alone was reason enough to leave well enough alone. By the 1970s and 80s, as Honda and Toyota expanded aggressively into American and European markets with cars like the Accord, the Civic, the Corolla, and the Celica, competitors like General Motors, Ford, and a growing number of European manufacturers had already begun standardizing four-wheel disc brakes across many of their performance and even mainstream models. Western automotive journalists, raised in an entirely different engineering culture, one that often equated newer hardware with better engineering almost reflexively, began asking the very question at the heart of this story. Why does a Honda Civic, a car already praised in road tests for its clever packaging and its remarkably efficient engine, still have drums out back like something borrowed from another era entirely? The honest answer, rarely printed in glossy sales brochures aimed at first-time buyers, came down to enormous production volumes combined with a stubborn, almost sentimental loyalty to the root philosophy of doing more with less. shaving even a few dollars off the rear brake system, multiplied across hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions, of vehicles sold every single year across dozens of markets, represented real money that could be reinvested exactly where Honda and Toyota actually wanted to compete, in engine efficiency, long-term reliability, and interior refinement that customers would notice and feel every single day. The humble rear drum brake became, in a very real sense, the quiet sacrifice that let the rest of the car shine brighter in comparison tests and owner satisfaction surveys alike, even as critics quietly grumbled about it in the fine print of their reviews. Reliability data from those decades only reinforced this old decision rather than challenging it in any meaningful way. Sealed away from direct exposure to rain, road salt, and flying debris the way front discs were, rear drum brakes on Honda and Toyota vehicles routinely outlasted almost every other mechanical component on the car, sometimes surviving 200,000 or 300,000 kilometers with barely a second thought from the owner, long past the point where the engine itself might need a rebuild. For a company like Toyota, building a global reputation on the back of near-mythical durability, especially across the dusty roads of Southeast Asia, the savannas and dirt tracks of Africa, and the backroads of rural America, a drum brake that any local mechanic could service with a hammer, a screwdriver, and a basic socket set wasn't a step backward at all. It was, disguised in plain gray steel, one of the company's quietest and most effective competitive advantages, a piece of the Toyota reputation for indestructibility that most owners never consciously credited. Honda's engineers, carrying forward Soichiro Honda's own founding belief in building dependable, accessible machines for ordinary working people rather than trophies for wealthy enthusiasts, embraced this same nostalgic logic just as firmly, keeping drums on the humble Civic, the later Fit, and countless small Toyota Corollas and Yaris models sold to families who valued a low repair bill and a mechanic they trusted far more than a badge of engineering sophistication they would never personally test on a racetrack. It's worth pausing here to compare this philosophy against what was happening on the other side of the world, because the contrast reveals just how deliberate this choice really was. European manufacturers like Citroën and Alfa Romeo had pushed disc brakes into mainstream production as early as the 1950s, driven by a very different set of priorities, a culture obsessed with motorsport pedigree, high-speed autobahn cruising, and a customer base willing to pay a premium for perceived sophistication. American manufacturers followed a similar path through the 60s and 70s, largely because heavier, more powerful domestic cars genuinely needed the superior heat dissipation that disc brakes offered on repeated hard stops. Japan's post-war market looked nothing like either of these worlds. Average driving speeds were lower, city traffic was dense and slow, and the primary demand from ordinary buyers was a car that simply refused to break down, not a car that could shed speed dramatically from a high-speed autobahn run. Honda and Toyota engineers, studying these different markets closely as they prepared for export, understood that a rear drum brake, on a lightweight, front-engine economy car with modest performance, posed essentially zero real-world safety compromise for the vast majority of driving conditions their customers actually faced. The perceived gap between drums and discs was, in large part, a cultural expectation imported from Europe and America rather than a genuine engineering shortfall rooted in Japanese driving reality. This is also where the nostalgia runs deepest for anyone who grew up around these cars. Ask any longtime Toyota or Honda mechanic about drum brakes, and the conversation rarely stays purely technical for long. They'll talk about how a drum brake job, done right, could keep a family's only car running reliably through years of harsh winters and unpaved roads, using parts that cost a fraction of what a disc brake conversion would have demanded. They'll talk about fathers teaching sons exactly the way that Civic owner did in 1978, passing down not just a repair skill, but an entire worldview about what a car is actually supposed to do, quietly and reliably serve a family for as long as possible without draining their savings. That inherited wisdom, passed hand to hand across driveways and repair shops for 2 full generations, is the real reason this humble, unglamorous piece of stamped steel survived so stubbornly long after critics assumed it should have vanished entirely. Eventually, of course, the world caught up to this old philosophy, and market pressure, combined with new stability control regulations that function far more precisely and predictably with discs on all 4 corners rather than a mismatched front disc, rear drum setup, gradually pushed Honda and Toyota to phase out rear drums across most of their global lineups by the 2010s. But even then, this transition happened slower, more reluctantly, and far more selectively than it did at almost any competing manufacturer, one final echo of a route that had never fully let go of its post-war origins, even as the company itself had grown into a global industrial giant many times over. Remarkably, even today, certain base trim economy models sold in developing markets around the world, from the Toyota Vios in Southeast Asia to entry-level Honda models sold across parts of So the real answer to why Honda and Toyota couldn't seem to let go of drum brakes was never really about outdated engineering, or about falling behind the rest of the industry the way some critics assumed. It was about a set of values planted deep in the roots of post-war Japanese manufacturing, values that quietly prioritized durability, affordability, and mechanical honesty over unnecessary sophistication for its own sake, values forged in a landscape where every part had to earn its place on the car through pure usefulness rather than marketing appeal. That father crouched beside his Civic in 1978, showing his son a dusty brake shoe in the driveway, wasn't behind the times at all. He understood something that took the